Hello, everyone. I am Ruth-Ellen Associate Curator and Special Collections Librarian at Rare Book School. Thank you so much for joining us today for the second RBS online panel discussion, Books as Bridges. If you could just make sure to keep your video turned off when you log in. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that Rare Book School in Charlottesville, Virginia is located on the traditional territory of the Monacan Indian Nation.
Hi, I'm Laura Perrings, Director of Programs and Education at Rare Book School. Rare Book School draws together many people from across the United States and around the world who are passionate about books, manuscripts, and cultural heritage. One of the great joys of attending an RBS course is having a chance to learn from individuals from all walks of life who share this common interest. We wanted to build on this kind of lively discussion that takes place during our RBS course sessions by holding this panel, which features well-known figures in our community who talk about rare books and artifacts with a wide variety of publics in various settings and across different media, including public television.
We'd like to welcome Krystal Appiah, librarian at the Albert and Shirley Small Special Collections Library, with whom we work very closely every summer during Rare Book School courses. We'd also like to welcome Mark Dimunation, Chief of the Rare Book and Special Collections Division of the Library of Congress. He is a longtime RBS faculty member. Our next panelist, Selby Kiffer, is the Senior Vice President and International Senior Specialist of Sotheby's, and he also serves on the Board of Directors of RBS. And finally, Rebecca Romney, our fourth panelist, is co-founder of Type Punch Matrix Books, and we had the pleasure of welcoming her to Rare Book School last summer as a lecturer during our course week.
The panel will focus on how rare books and artifacts serve as bridges connecting individuals, communities, and institutions with each other and with the past. Panelists will also reflect on the challenges of moving from in-person outreach to online venues for public engagement. Our panelists will be exploring 6 questions that Ruth-Ellen and I have prepared, and we will be opening our conversation to live Q&A via chat only at 4:55 p.m. Eastern Time. At that point, you may type in your questions for the panelists.
So we'd like to acknowledge that a great deal has happened in the US and across the world since we first planned this panel in early April. This includes the massive ongoing protests in response to anti-Black racism, police brutality, and the killings of Black individuals like George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and Rayshard Brooks. So Rare Book School has issued a statement in response to these events, and I'd like to repeat that we stand in solidarity with all people who are striving to make a world of racial equality and justice, and that we at Rare Book School are committed to the ongoing labor of putting our principles into action.
So our first question is for all 4 of the panelists. You are all experts in rare books and archives, and an important part of your job is to interact with the public and with large groups of people, although you've done so in many different ways. Could you talk about the different communities and audiences with whom you have interacted?
And we'd like to start off with Mark as our first respondent to this question.
Sure, thank you. And thank you for hosting this event. I think it's, given what we're all facing, it's a timely discussion. Well, let me just start off by saying, given the nature and the size of the Library of Congress, we kind of run the gamut in terms of audiences and constituencies. I think much more so than more specialized or localized institutions. So we have a wide range of interested communities and visitors that we need to introduce them to the contents and materials of the Library of Congress. We are, in essence, really a kind of crossroads for interested parties, for those people interested in the book and the material object archives and other special collections. Specifically within rare books, we are introduced to a large number of these various communities. So over the years, Rare Book and Special Collections Division at the Library of Congress has hosted any number of groups. Certainly, first and foremost, as the Library of Congress, we have the members of Congress that we need to address and their constituent interests, as we are, in fact, their library. But we've also, over time, bring in scholars and researchers. We are first and foremost a research library, so scholars with connections, and as well as independent researchers and other kinds of scholars. We have practitioners that come through, book artists, printmakers, printers, a variety of other people who are more involved with the kind of physical creation of materials that are involved with the books. We have visiting dignitaries. As the Rare Book Division, we're often the destination for visitors to come. Donors, of course, visiting libraries and librarians, and also participants of programs that the Library of Congress itself is hosting, such as the book festival events, the National Book Festival speaker events, performances that the Library of Congress hosts, even Rare Book's own Thursdays at 3 lecture series. So all these possible groups have been brought through, and for them we've done a large variety of approaches to introducing them to the materials of the division. I don't think there are any that would be surprising to our colleagues here listening in today. Everything from dog and pony shows to more complicated, at least in Rare Books, more complicated tabletop exhibits where we put up between 60 and 120 items on an open table display, to full-on exhibits at the Library of Congress, pop-ups, which LC has been doing the last few years, and then any number of classroom instructions. So it's quite a parade, as you can imagine, at the Library of Congress. We've had everything from Justice Ginsburg and Vernon Jordan to Diane von Furstenberg and the boys from Queer Eyes and third graders, but the AIB. I mean, we really do run the gamut of visitors that have come through. I will say one thing, and then I'll turn it over to my colleagues. One of the benefits of working at the Library of Congress is that we have the opportunity to have clusters of individuals with influence and interest that are introduced to our really wonderful collections, especially those in Rare Books. So we have over the years seen many of the poets laureate that have come through. Including the current one, Joy Harjo and Tracy K. Smith and Juan Felipe Pereira, but also speakers at the National Book Festival, Karen Armstrong, Neil Patrick Harris. There's a whole parade of influential and interesting people that not only are connected to the library, but also bring the experience of the library forward to other groups. So yes, we are in fact quite a quilt of constituents and communities. That's it for me.
Thank you, Mark. Rebecca, would you like to talk about your experiences?
Yes, it's quite different from what Mark said. I should give a little bit of background for myself because I'm a rare book dealer, and I started in the trade in a very unusual environment. Bowman Rare Books is a dealer that's best known in New York and Philadelphia, the East Coast, and I started working for them. This was my introduction to Rare Books for that gallery they opened up in Las Vegas. And so that has actually colored the entirety of my experience in Rare Books. Like for the first about 8 years of my career, I was being exposed on a daily basis to people coming into this gallery in Las Vegas, tourists, people who are in bathing suits without a pool in sight. And, people literally, I've seen this, carry a fishbowl full of neon blue booze on their shoulder while walking through the casino. And, all sorts of bizarre things that you associate with Las Vegas coming through, looking at these books, which sounds silly, but in practical terms, what it also meant was that hundreds of people were coming through every day and holding a rare book for the first time. And I saw over and over again the reaction that people had, not only when they first discovered that this was a thing, like, oh, first edition of my favorite book, or, oh, that's a book from, the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, or something like that. There's this snap that happens where people are interested in this if they only know it exists. And to have that entry point, I realized, was crucial. And so a place like Las Vegas seems very silly, but because so many people come through there every single day, you get a very high volume of contact. And I just saw personally how many people that could affect, and that affected everything else that I did moving forward. The next major audience that I interacted with is the television appearances that I did. This was also growing out of my experience in Las Vegas. I was managing the only rare book gallery in town, which meant that when the History Channel show Pawn Stars was looking for a rare book specialist, I was the one that they called. And this show was very interesting. It was, it had about 7 million viewers per episode at its peak, which is a lot of people. And it was, for those who aren't familiar, it's kind of like an edgier version of Antiques Roadshow. It certainly came with its own problems. I endlessly had problems with the title of it, for example, the title being a pun on something else. And so when people would introduce me as a pawn star, I'd have to be very clear that that's P-A-W-N. But it was actually a very effective vehicle for introducing people to basic concepts of rare books who weren't necessarily looking for it or seeking it out. And it reinforced my belief that once people are exposed to this, they're actually quite interested in it. Building from that, I wrote a book that was meant to be a bit of an introduction, an overview to book history to counter the perception that rare books are niche. It was printed in 2017 by HarperCollins, printer's error. And the whole point of it was to focus on these books and these concepts in book history as connections to individual people across time, from Benjamin Franklin to Mary Wollstonecraft to Johannes Gutenberg. So it was just one more way to try to engage an audience beyond our little bubble that it's very easy to sink into. And the last audience that I think is important to address, particularly right now, is online audiences through things like social media. This was in some ways a continuing responsibility for me from Pawn Stars, where, you know, people were like, I want to learn more about rare books. I want to learn more about what's happening. And I started saying, okay, well, I'm going to put out, I'm going to create a presence online so that when people are asking about the books and things, there's some sort of interactive vehicle there. And Instagram has become the primary vehicle for me. There's over 8,000 people there. And my idea for that is that this is not a replacement for handling rare books. This is not a replacement for the person-to-person connections, but going back to this philosophy that there are so many people who don't know even that this exists and that this is something they can be part of. I'm looking for that first point of entry and to develop as many opportunities as possible for people to come into that intersection. Because I know myself that I fell into books, rare books, quite accidentally, and I would not have if I weren't just lucky enough to have been in the right place at the right time. So that's informed all of my thinking with how I interact with the audiences and which vehicles I choose to interact with audiences.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. Krystal, would you like to talk about the different communities and audience you've interacted with through your position at UVA and your previous positions? Oh, just gonna unmute you. There you go.
So yeah, I currently am the instruction librarian at UVA, so I manage the instruction program for groups that come in who are using rare materials outside of the reading room. So they're not registering to do their own research, but they want to learn about the materials in some way. So I usually spend a lot of time working with undergraduates and graduate students. The university sometimes has, you know, VIPs as well, might have ambassadors and other dignitaries coming to the Center for Politics. And those staff members might make a connection and have a presentation about what types of materials we might have related to that cultural area so that they have a better understanding sort of like the materials that we have. We also work with adults looking for lifelong learning opportunities. So it might be local community groups that come in. Often they just want a general introduction to special collections and rare books. Other times they have a particular interest that they want to see talked about with that. For example, we had a nature journaling club come in, and it's an opportunity for them to look at a lot of our sort of natural history materials. We also do a lot during the summertime when some, for a lot of special collections libraries, that might be a quieter time. For us, that's quite busy. In addition to Rare Book School, a lot of institutes in town and at UVA, we have a Young Writers Workshop that comes in, which are teenagers who are learning how to write. And so we're able to show them, examples from famous writers' archives and manuscripts, so that they're able to see sort of the process of writing and sort of understand that, these great works aren't just born, but that they take time to develop. And so helping those high school students sort of see themselves and be able to replicate that type of process. Sometimes have, K-12 teachers and students coming in. Once had some students from a summer music camp come, looked at some of our music materials, including some medieval choir books, and even actually sang a little bit from that. So that was quite fun. So we work with a great variety of people like Rebecca. We want to give people this comfortable entry point where they can come in and learn about the materials, learn about a subject, and not feel like they're making a mistake if they're not unsure of how to act in that type of environment. That we want to make this a comfortable place that they'll want to come in again or share with their friends.
Great, thank you, Krystal. Selby, would you like to talk about your experiences in the auction world?
Sure. Going back before that, I thought that I was going to be a librarian. Once I gave up on being an English professor, I graduated from Columbia and started working at Sotheby's part-time more than 36 years ago. It's now full-time. That's partly because no library would have me, although I did apply to some library positions. So I look at books from a lot of different angles, and I certainly accept Rebecca's comment that books are niche, but books are also everywhere. And when I was doing the first few seasons of Antiques Roadshow, even that first year when it wasn't a phenomenon yet and very few people were coming, there were always people at the book table, because maybe you can't find a piece of porcelain to bring in, or silver, or a painting, but everyone can dig up an old book and bring it in. And in large part, what I do is I'm talking to people about the value of what they have. And that ranges from the most sophisticated collectors in the world to people who have our address or email address or telephone number and call up. And those calls are always worth taking, because you never really do know what someone is going to have. And some great treasures have turned up that way. But beyond people who are dedicated collectors, we end up speaking with people who use books and manuscripts in other ways, because we really are dealing with the raw material of research. So we're in touch with, and many dealers are as well, with all of the different scholarly papers projects around the country, people who are publishing the papers of the president. So we know, speaking of UVA, that the papers of George Washington is not going to buy a newly discovered George Washington letter, but they do want the text, they do want a copy, they do want to know about the provenance. So we're engaged with scholars and students and people like that as well. Book collectors groups, I love. I think most of all, we quite often host school groups here to come in for a tour and see what we're selling. They have that same reaction that Rebecca was describing. I didn't know this sort of thing existed. And it's fun if students have been studying a particular concept or period or person, to be able to show them an artifact of that person. So books, their value, both scholarly and commercial, is what I'm involved with. A former colleague of mine in the contemporary art department used to say, "My job is to make art expensive." I've never felt that was my job with books, but I don't mind if it turns out that way sometimes.
Thank you so much. And it's wonderful to hear more about all of your different backgrounds. So our follow-up question is, you've each spoken about the different communities you worked with, and I'm wondering, or we're wondering, if there's a group or community with whom you'd really like to interact and you haven't had the chance yet to do that. And so for this, we'd like to start with Rebecca.
Okay, so this was a little difficult because I think more in terms of I think wider philosophies. Instead of specific examples. Like I think all of us were talking about interactions with younger people in some form, students or research, that type of thing, and I feel like that's a really important emphasis in what I do, or at least what I'm interested in within the trade, is that one, I think the earlier that they have that chance to catch that sense of wonder, the better, and that can affect their lives in ways that they don't even expect. Even if, you know, they become a scientist or something completely unrelated, they don't have to by any means go into rare books, but that it really can affect their lives for the better. So I like catching people early, but moreover, this is in some ways maybe a controversial opinion, at least among my colleagues in the trade, perhaps, but I believe that younger generations more instinctively get the idea of rare books and manuscripts as objects, as historical artifacts. I think that you think things very differently if you look at a book and to you that copy of Moby Dick is just the Moby Dick. But if you are someone who grew up only in the digital age, you see a copy of Moby Dick and you understand that that's a print book, and I can read that same text in ebook format, and that those are two different things. The physical object is its own thing. And to me, that's very instinctive from what I've observed. And I think that for that reason, rare books and the potential for study and interest in them is going to be very, very strong, and has already proven itself to be strong. One of the things that I've been involved in for encouraging more interaction with that community myself is when my colleague at Honey and Wax, Heather O'Donnell, and we founded the Honey and Wax Book Collecting Prize, which is an annual award for a book collection created by a young woman in the United States, aged 30 or younger. And initially we did it partially just to give a little bit of representation to this group of like, look, young people are collecting, they're doing really interesting things. And the longer we did it, the more we realized, oh, not only are they doing interesting things, but I'm learning things from them that I did not expect. I never thought of collecting that way, and that is fascinating. And so it became, it almost inverted itself of, I thought I was doing this thing of saying, look at this thing I know that these collectors exist, and instead these collectors like, I have something to tell you, which is great. The other thing that I'll mention is that I also am always actively seeking to work with people from underrepresented communities, underrepresented across the board. Like I really want to help people get the tools to connect with inspirations to models in history. I think of letters that I've received or collections I've seen in the Honey and Wax Prize admissions about, you know, LGBTQ youth being like, I want to connect with models in the past, and to be able to help them get those tools in order to engage with history and find themselves. And to find that community is important to me. And I think also when you are in a position of being underrepresented, that is a really tricky thing when it comes to things like book fairs or events in the rare book world, where speaking from experience, both from being young and in the rare book trade where there are fewer women dealers, I think you're much more conscious of feeling a little bit of imposter syndrome. And so with that in mind, I'm always thinking in terms of conscious invitations and active support to again, to sort of overcome some of the obstacles to make sure we're creating as many points of entry as possible.
Great, so our next person we'd like to ask about who they would like to work with more is Mark.
Thanks. Yeah, I would like to echo what Rebecca just said in terms of experiencing communities that aren't traditionally associated with the world of rare books and their take on both collecting and what those materials are. We at the Library of Congress host a a parallel and friendly association with the book collecting competition. This one sponsored by the ABAA, the Library of Congress, and funded in part by the Kislak Foundation, geared towards university students. And the collections that have, it's a national book collecting competition, and the kinds of collections students come up with, and their idea of what to collect and how to create that universe is really a revelation. And I think it really is the story of what the future of books and book collecting will be. I'm torn as to how to answer the question that's being asked. On the one hand, we have at the Library of Congress, well, they're my collections, let's just call them mine. I have collections at the Library of Congress that are massive specialties, and some of the great caches of material of their format and kind. And I would really love to see that we become more than just a place for a casual visit. That is, I'd rather see us become a sort of galvanizing center for the study of book arts. We have a massive book arts collection at the Library of Congress. And it would be great if we could move beyond the friendly symposium and the occasional visit and turn the collection into a real active part of the community, to become an axle rather than a spoke to the community. And that would be also true with the early printed book collection, where I think the kind of constituencies that I wish we could reach out to has to do with more of degree than type. That is, I would love for us to be able to have a more intensive sense of the center for the study of the early printed book. So there are those examples, but I think fundamentally, I think Rebecca really touched on it. I think there's one thing I wish we could do in Rare Book and Special Collections Division, and I have a staff that's really bright and really energized and very creative in their outreach, is I would love for us to have a better and more direct access with a general interest, whether that be the public or even more so classroom instruction. We spend a lot of time collecting and interpreting and discussing the nature of primary materials and material objects and why they're important. And I really feel as if we miss that opportunity to step into the classroom and do it. Certainly at the Library of Congress, there's already an office specifically about connecting with school teachers and classrooms. And certainly an American specialist who's now retired, Rosemary Fry-Placas, was a pioneer in terms of bringing primary materials to classrooms. But I would love to see that be one of the fundamental aspects of outreach. It certainly talks to the mission of the Library of Congress. But if we're going to cultivate the younger reader and collector that Rebecca's talking about, one way is to be able to step in and say, here's a cache of materials that your teacher is going to help you work with, but you need to know that they're here. And you can come work with them, or we'll give them to you digitally. So I think that kind of outreach is something that I would really love to cultivate. I've been thinking a lot about this because of the sequester and the shutdown, and I'm beginning to feel like we are in a moment. I know you'll get down to this later on, but I think we're at a moment where we're beginning to move beyond old institutional modes of behavior. I think we are kind of approaching a moment in which our materials are going to blend together across institutions, because our real intention is to present content rather than institutionally branded content. I think if we're going to make this kind of virtual outreach to using publics that are non-traditional or currently not under our wing, that we're going to have to make an outreach that brings them what they need regardless where it comes from. So an interesting question. Thanks.
I guess I'm up next.
Yes.
Well, I'm tempted to say a group I'd like to get to know better is estate lawyers and fiduciaries, but everyone would take that amiss probably. There are several groups that I'd like to work with more. I do like young people. Until recently, I coached youth soccer, boys and girls, and I loved that interaction. And I would like the opportunity to do something on a different level with elementary school, junior high school kids as well. I would like to maybe spend more time with real scholars to learn from them. Not just great book scholars like Paul Needham, who I'm fortunate enough to know and be able to talk to from time to time, but maybe now, especially with historical scholars and with the current events that were alluded to, what is the future of manuscript collecting, and what's going to happen to the papers of a figure who was celebrated in the past and perhaps is no longer celebrated. I think those are big questions that are going to impact what a lot of us do, and that I think do need to be answered. That goes to the point that Mark just made about maybe an emphasis on content rather than and I don't want to misrepresent what you said, Mark, but working virtually, do you really need that original material? I think it's vital. I'm here in my office today because I've found through the quarantine, I could do a lot of my work at home. I was surprised, maybe 80%, but there comes a point where you have to have the book in your hand if you're going to describe it and catalog it. And I think that's a question that scholars and academics are going to have to grapple with together with collectors. And it's not just in the book and manuscript field, but it's certainly true in that field that it is often the collectors who really have identified new areas of collecting, overlooked aspects of culture that they have saved, and that only subsequently end up oftentimes through donation, generous donation of those collectors to the great cultural institutions, libraries, and museums around the country. So I think sometimes, and I'm probably prejudiced, I think sometimes collectors are slighted a little bit by academic groups, but they're really important, and I think they should be encouraged from the very young age and in the very new avenues that Rebecca was speaking about, to those who are well established and reworking well-plowed ground. So I don't know if that really was a particularly direct answer to that question, but that's what I have to say at the moment.
Thank you, Selby. Krystal, would you like to talk about the audiences that you haven't had a chance to reach out to as much at UVA?
Okay, thank you. Well, like Mark and Rebecca, I'm really interested in K-12 audiences, both students and teachers. Introducing teachers to sources so they can, integrate them into the curriculum in the classroom, as well as bringing those students onto our campus and showing them materials. And there are challenges with funding and time, which is why it hasn't been happening as much as I would like to, but involved with some groups like, Teaching with Primary Sources, that looking at strategies and ways to try and get those types of materials and methodologies to teach with them too, because that's another area where K-12 teachers haven't necessarily had the training. Some have, but some haven't. So wish we would see more of that in special collections. And another, one of my areas of interest too is African American history. So I'm interested in connecting with local members of the African American community. Done a little bit of work with our local African American Cultural Center. Did a session for some of their high school tour guides about local African American history, and they were researching the topics and got to see some primary sources of the things that they had, the topics that they had been studying. So that was exciting, and just would like to see more opportunities like that to, again, to bring people who are not accustomed to being in archives or knowing it's a place that they can belong and use. Bringing those people into the library is important to me.
Wonderful, thank you. Our next question. How do different methods for exploring and learning about rare books as objects and for engaging with the public impact your work and your approach to your work? Could you compare what it is like to engage with books and people in person with engaging with them online or through televised venues?
And our first respondent is Krystal.
Okay. Am I unmuted? Yes. Okay, great. Thanks. So one thing, I like to make it an interactive process. I don't like being a talking head, whether it's, formal class or, a community group coming in. I want them to be asking questions, to be looking at the materials, to really be thinking about what they're seeing. So try to make the environment conversational, so they feel comfortable, talking and asking questions as we go along. And I think they get more out of it. They feel like they're an active part of the process. So that's, I think, one of my main strategies for working with rare books and archival materials. And trying to think of ways to sort of transition that into the online environment. Haven't had to do that so much yet, but that's going to be happening a lot more in the fall. Social media is one way too, as I think Rebecca mentioned earlier, those to try and get some interactive processes about materials out to the public and sort of getting feedback from them about what they think is important about in a photograph. Like they may think something's very significant or interesting that I didn't notice. So trying to make it, I think, a two-way process is what's sort of significant to me, and trying to think of ways to replicate that in the online environment. Like I've done some breakout groups on online class sessions, and that's been a bit more successful again in getting people to feel like they can talk about the materials, like they have ownership and enough sort of knowledge to say something significant about those materials.
Great. And Mark, would you like to respond next?
Sure. Well, this is what we're all facing, isn't it? Is how do we take the world that we're used to, that we become quite proficient in, and convert it to a very different reality? I mean, there are a couple of questions that come to mind immediately. How do I convey the materiality of an object through a device such as what we're doing right now? And can you really zoom the experience of materiality? It's a hard question. Very much like Krystal was saying, we have several opportunities for bringing people in contact with materials when we're doing it one-on-one in live time, real people sitting across. Selby, I can't tell you how excited I was when you held up a real book. I just haven't seen a real book in a long time. And we have two kinds of approaches. One is the kind of, I don't know, iconic scorched earth, which, large institutions can do. I mean, I can run the American Revolution past your eyes, from the Baysan book to the Declaration of Independence. And it can be at that level, which has a benefit at a certain level, which is it introduces people to kind of significant moments that they may have only read about or understood. And here is this physical object, which really embodies that moment in a way that only books and manuscripts can do. And so if we can do that in front of people, that's a way of bringing them in direct relationship with the material. The other also comes from collections of very large size, also mimicked in Rare Book School too, I might add. In fact, I would probably suggest this developed in my mind from Rare Book School, which is to introduce a student to an iconic object, but to give them an onslaught of multiples of similar, less valuable materials to play with, so that you can talk about a significant moment of Tom Paine's pamphlet, but then introduce them to bound widths of 20 or 30 or 40 American pamphlets that they can work with and play with, so they can make the jump from a more modest piece to something that is registered historically. And I think these are all things that are really important. Whether we do it one-on-one, whether we do it in a very controlled presentation, we're still living and working with our books. And I think a lot of it comes down to how do we perform with our books. I mean, literally interact with our books in front of people, because I think that also conveys a great deal of respect. The question is, how do we move that experience to a virtual experience? In fact, if we do we replace that with something else? Do we try and replicate it in a different way? I think we can borrow a little bit from digital scholarship. Library of Congress has been working with story maps, for example, which is a way of taking, can be a way of taking a large mass of material that might be somewhat difficult to comprehend and create a new avenue towards understanding. A second idea, whether we produce this on tape or whatever, is if you can't convey the materiality of the object itself, then show them how it's made. So at least they have an understanding of what, so you can't say, feel this paper, isn't this wonderful, but you can show how paper is made and have them get a sense of what it is we're talking about. But I think we're going to have to be very clever and smart. Third, I will say, and this is certainly hopefully one of the lessons we've all learned in the last month in particular, is I think sometimes when we're sitting down with the materials that we know and love, we behave as if we know and love them more than the people that are sitting across from us. And it may be times for us to listen, to let go of our materials and hand them over across the table in a virtual way, and have people tell us what they mean to them rather than my telling them what I think they mean. It may be a very valuable lesson. Krystal said it very nicely, that people have experiences of materials and they need to bring that to the table. If we really believe, as we say at the Library of Congress, that every book has a story, I may not be the person that tells that story. It may in fact be the person that's sitting across from me. So.
Great, thank you, Mark. So we'd like to hear from Selby next.
Selby, I think. Could you
Yes.
just recapitulate the question?
So the question was, how do different methods for exploring and learning about rare books as objects and for engaging with the public impact your work and your approach to your work? Could you compare what it is like to engage with books and people in person versus engaging with them online or through television, for example?
Well, the best way to engage with someone about a book is to be talking about their object, because they know something about it, they want to know more about it, and they're really interested in it. I think we all become a little too reliant on the language of books and talk in terms of format and collation and use binding terms that no one knows. As the border is a French fillet. You know, Mark knows that's 3 unequally spaced gilt rules, but I didn't know that till recently. So I think we need to use simple language, direct language, not elementary language, but explain things as they are. And I think we need to encourage people to look at lots and lots of books, because that's really how you learn to make the distinctions. I mean, books are really tricky. You can have 2 books printed within 3 years of each other on the same subject in similar condition, and one is worth $8,000 or $10,000 and one is not even worth $800. And all sorts of factors play into that aren't necessarily obvious from the book itself. And it's only by, I think, bringing that experience where people start to understand nuance and appreciate differences and realize that leather-bound set of the world's 100 greatest novels published by the Franklin Mint that your uncle has proudly in his den, those really aren't beautiful books. And you can get really important and beautiful books for less than that set cost. I realize I keep talking in terms of value. I'm sorry, it's a function of what I do. But, you know, it is true, as Thomas Paine said, what we attain to cheaply, we don't value highly. He said it more elegantly than that. So that's it. I realize we're only halfway through our questions, so I'll yield.
Thank you, Selby. And Rebecca?
First, I'd really like to reiterate what Krystal started to say and Mark added and Selby also mentioned, which is how important it is in in-person interactions in particular to listen to people. This is actually something that you want to talk about the crass commercial side that I think about a lot in terms of best sales technique. When I was hiring and training people for the gallery in Las Vegas, the thing I would say is that if you were doing most of the talking in an interaction, then you have let it go off the rails. You need to be listening to them. And that's actually the best way to engage with the public on one-on-one, because if you listen to them, they will tell you what they are interested in. And we have this inclination, I think, because we have the specialized knowledge. We have, they're going to be asking us questions. We feel like we are the authority and we're leading them through. But in fact, I think that leads us to a sense of complacency of having, making assumptions on what we think they should be interested in or what they're interested in, when in fact, we just need to stop and listen and they will tell us. And that's a much better way to go about it. It's a much more authentic way to connect human to human. And it's just truly, it's a better sales technique. It's a lot easier way to get people engaged because they will tell you what they're interested in if you stop to listen. The other aspect of that, the moving into digital approaches or online, televised, anything like that, as opposed to in person, the main philosophy that I bring to that is that every medium has its own strengths and weaknesses. And I think it's a mistake to apply a one-size-fits-all approach. You can't do the same things you do in person as you would do online or on TV. So, for example, I think we all agree, like the great strength of in person is you get to touch the books. There's materiality, and that is so powerful. And it's so powerful, in fact, that it does most of the talking for us. And so I think we tend to rely on that because we also believe it's very important. But that doesn't mean that the internet, for example, doesn't have its own things that it offers. It certainly has that as a weakness. But, Mark was just talking about story maps, this sort of like app format that you can use. We use that too. It creates these amazing sort of ways to engage with material, very visually striking. And I think it is really helpful with accessibility, getting people interested. And I think that is obviously the main strength of the internet is accessibility. And so that's something to consider as opposed to in person. That's only one person at a time. But with the internet, the accessibility argument really takes on different contours and should be used consciously as its advantage. An example I think of with this is Rebecca Bauman, who teaches book history courses and rare books curatorship and such at the Lilly Library. In the lockdown with the pandemic, she changed one of her normal assignments. She usually has her students create a collection, like their own collection, out of what is available in the Lilly Library stacks. And she switched that up for the pandemic situation where they could access all of this information online. And so they could create almost like their dream collection. And so that's a really interesting way to think about engaging in collecting and how you would collect. And it lowers one of the barriers to accessibility in collecting, which is to say, having the money or the space or those types of very classic barriers. So the internet is really full of possibilities if we just embrace that that's its strength. Another example I would give really quickly is crowdsourcing. Like I once tweeted about a book that was bound in a kind of leather that I had never seen before. And then there was a little bit of debate. And afterwards I learned that it was a shark. And I would not have known that if I hadn't, I asked my colleagues in person, but I really needed that, the amount of travel of information you can get from the internet. That's a strength that I think that we need to think consciously about and actively use. So to me, it's not an either or, it's really an and situation.
Yeah. So we're going to actually jump ahead to it in our questions because we have about 10 minutes left. And so this was actually going to be our 5th question. And it kind of builds on what Rebecca was just talking about, how it's important to listen. And so we were wondering, when interacting with the public, have you ever experienced an unexpected insight from an audience member or from a patron of your institution? How does reaching out to others help those of us in the rare book world reconsider our own collections? And so for this one, we'd like to start with Selby.
Well, thinking of something else Rebecca said, I would certainly like the opportunity to create a collection out of the stacks of the Lilly Library. But that aside, you do learn. I learned a great thing, which I have used over and over and over in speaking to people. A lot of the people who contact Sotheby's think they have something valuable. They're hoping that we can sell it. They sometimes don't understand that we hope the exact same thing. It's no pleasure to tell someone that they don't have something that's valuable. But a very common book from the 19th century is the personal memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant. It was published posthumously. It was published by Mark Twain's publishing company. It was a huge bestseller. I think Julia Grant got royalties from 1885 through 1890 of something like $500 million. And each volume 1 has a facsimile inscription by Grant dedicated to the soldiers and sailors of the United States. And an inordinate number of people see that, they think it's actually signed, they call, they want to know what it's worth. This gets into how does dealing with a book in person differ from dealing with it online. So if you're chatting with someone on the phone or even on Zoom, it can be hard to convey that. If I go to my office and bring out another copy with the same inscription, that helps make it a little clearer. But I was talking with someone and he pointed out to me that actually in the list of illustrations in the book, it says dedication, sample of Grant's handwriting. So that you can convey remotely over the telephone or something. And even though I've handled that book, you know, you don't spend a lot of time normally looking at the list of illustrations, but it was a great little fact to have, and I'm grateful to have it.
Great, thank you, Selby. Krystal.
So I wasn't going to share an insight, but an observation of unexpected consequence of outreach is when I was at the library company where I previously worked, I had done an exhibition on African Americans after the Civil War, and someone walking by, you know, seeing advertised come in, he's a member of a business men's club in the city, invited me to give a talk to the club during their monthly meetings. And he mentioned, you know, it was not a very diverse space, but went there, you know, they're very gracious, you know, talked to them if you ask questions. But what really caught my eye was in the back of the room that there was a Black waitress, like, listening to my presentation, like someone making a connection to sort of those older materials that I had not expected to have the opportunity to do that. And, you know, even my current position, and sort of love seeing who stops at what types of exhibits, you know, seeing the delivery people or facilities management stopping and seeing certain works that catch their interest, or something where they feel a connection to these archival materials where often, you know, they think they would not belong or see themselves in those types of spaces.
Thank you, Krystal. And so our next person we wanted to hear from was Rebecca.
Yes, I'm thinking in my case less about a particular example, but more referencing what Selby mentioned earlier in terms of what language that we're using. The main insight that I receive, and I'm really grateful to receive constantly, is feedback, either on social media or when I'm doing lectures, that type of thing, or even from director and TV, is that we always have to be thinking about how we're casually talking about terminology, that if I don't define compositors, people don't know what that means. And so it's really common, people say, okay, can you explain, you just said octavo, what does octavo mean? And I find that as specialists, it's so easy for us to like wrap ourselves up in this comforting blanket of our expertise. Like, and so it's really easy to forget that some things that seem really basic to us and therefore often sometimes boring are in fact often fascinating to newcomers. And that's the kind of aspect that I'm always kind of looking to feed on, is thinking critically about the fatigue that we experience as specialists when we are explaining like what first edition means for the billionth time. And like, frankly, the day that I stop being moved by someone's like spark in their eyes when they first handle a rare book, it's like, no matter, I don't want to stop being moved by that. Like, even if it's a book that I'm not moved by personally, I feel like that day I have given into ennui, I've become an Edward Gorey character. That's not who I want to be. I really think that that kind of feedback is really important to constantly recognize and grow from and energize, feel energized from.
Wonderful, thank you, Rebecca. And Mark, as our last respondent.
Sure, and Rebecca touched upon the one experience I think we all strive for, and I agree. If we don't have that, we realize we've fallen, which is, and sometimes I'm caught up short because these books are familiar to me, but I'll be talking about something, I'll open the book, and I'm interrupted by this gasp of air. It's not that I don't love my book, but I'm not at that level of first confrontation. So I think that's what we want to capture. I mean, in fairness, it depends on who's in front of me and why they're there. I try to be very mindful of not using language that's too much associated with descriptive bibliography, because it is just lost on people. On the other hand, I find myself oftentimes pantomiming techniques while I'm talking, because I'm trying, suddenly I realize I have to explain to them how movable metal type impresses on paper, and I'm using this sort of inept pantomime, wishing I had some way of showing it. And I've had these funny experiences of going through what I think is a masterful explanation of printing and whatnot, to have the person with a great deal of awe say, "So is this handwritten?" So there are these moments where you realize what people are looking at may have nothing to do with what I'm yapping about. So it does go back to what I was talking about earlier. Sometimes I think it's smart for us to simply turn the book around and hand it, figuratively across the table and have people tell me what it is they're looking at. There are moments where I do want to impart something about it, because I think they're there. Classes are there for a reason. Book arts classes are there for a reason. But I'll end with this story, which is, we can sometimes get caught up I can sometimes get caught up in my shtick, right? And I had a group of printmakers from Washington, D.C., and I was asked to do a presentation of books, artist books that were heavily done by printmakers. In other words, a print emphasis, print making emphasis. And I had a whole array, and I was ending with not a print situation, but really a manuscript, which was the Tim Ely book. For those who don't know Tim Ely's work, it is masterful and mysterious and very difficult to grasp, and it has foreign-looking alphabets and other worlds that don't exist, and all sorts of geographical and astrological, and it's a whole rubric of scientific stuff. But you look through it and there's something going on, and it's glorious. And I've spent years playing with his books to try and better understand. But in order to make the point, I was just simply saying to the group, sometimes a book isn't as transparent as you might expect it to be. You really have to invest time and energy. For example, I don't quite know what Tim is doing here. And from the back of the room, someone who had been very kind of casually watching throughout said, "Really? It's pretty obvious to me." And I said, "Oh, tell me." And she came forward, and then she launched into this. This is clearly a play on blah, blah, blah mathematical theorem, and this is a reference to physical this and this and thermodynamics over here, and it's all tied together in this. And I'm like, "You got that from the back of the room?" I've been working, and she couldn't hold her humor long enough, and finally burst out laughing. I said, "What's going on?" She said, "Oh, well, I worked with Tim for 10 years, so I know what the book is about." But it was that moment that caught me, and it taught me something, which is sometimes it's not insight from other people, it's a revelation of something that isn't known. I think it goes back to learning how to listen to the interest of the audience and be clear in terms of our own objectives of what we're trying to impart.
Thank you very much, each of you, for your wonderful insights. We are ready to move on to our Q&A session. We will move through the questions roughly in the order in which they are being submitted via chat. So our first question is more of a reference and resource question. John Carter's ABC for Book Collectors is a classic text issued in multiple editions that many of us reference, but what more recent sources might we also consider? Anything that reflects recent and compelling research or possibly more accessible?
I have a very short answer for this that is in some ways just echoing the problem, which is that when I started in the trade, Carter's ABC was what we were given. That's the first step. We had to memorize all of that, and we were quizzed on it before we could pretty much do anything else. And just earlier this year, in my new company, we did our first round of hiring. And when I was first working with our new hire about this, I handed her Carter, and I hadn't looked at Carter for a long time, and I still believe it's a great piece of accessibility because it gives all those definitions, and it's available for free online thanks to Oaknall Press. You can just literally Google and you can find it. But Carter's definitions aren't the most accessible for everyone, and it takes a lot of work and effort. And so I would love to hear if anyone knows any alternatives that are as comprehensive. The problem with Carter is that he tends to get into historical or cultural digressions, and it gets very anecdotal and less straightforward. And on the one hand, that's really fun, but on the other hand, I've found that to newer audiences, to non-specialist audiences, it can be an uphill battle. So I have been working like in-house to do that, but I don't know of any sources that are more directly comprehensive, that are less Byzantine.
Can I just talk?
Yes.
So a recent study for beginners or early students is Sarah Warner's Studying Early Printed Books. I think that's a good practical guide. It has a lot of information. I have to kind of stick up for Carter. I've never gotten any of the later editions, and Rebecca's right, that does get drilled into you. I think I even made flashcards for some of the definitions eons ago.
Mark or Krystal, do you have any suggestions of useful resources similar to Carter?
The only thing I would say is that years ago, Terry Bellinger kind of acknowledged the problem with Carter and ended up trying to collect a physical representation of Carter, in part because it's much easier to see what you're talking about rather than to explain what it is you need to see.
And that collection is known as 3D Carter, and it is at Rare Book School. Our next question is from Susanna, and they ask, do the panelists consider that rare book exhibitions can offer comfortable entry points for audiences? Can book exhibitions serve to build bridges too? What are the panelists' curatorial approach in this regard, if any? And feel free to jump in. Yep.
Yeah, this is a kind of a bugaboo of mine because I love books. In a way, I've devoted my life to them, and so many book exhibitions are just so boring. You go in, you're excited, you know the author, you know the period, and I think book exhibitions have to get away from being so didactic. I think they should be more like an art gallery or a museum of the book, where you don't have to necessarily be making a point or tying case C into what's coming up in case F. Just put out some interesting things and some beautiful things. And I think they could be a great entry point. I actually find that too often they're a roadblock.
Well, I always try to find the human in the story because people connect to other people. So how can you frame, a book about, its human users or human users through time and who created the book. And so giving more information about the process, the more people who are involved with it, or something interesting in that story, I think helps to make that connection, makes it sort of less off-putting and less didactic.
Yeah, I think at the Library of Congress, the main exhibits, which are very long and planning and very expensive to produce, tend to be more content and less so about book history or about the material, usually the materiality of an object, like the current suffrage exhibit or the Rosa Parks exhibit. So I think we're quite good at making a variety of materials come alive and carry significance far beyond the meaning of a single bus coupon or a memo or a particular book, because we can launch a full story. So, but that tends to be a content-driven presentation. Within Rare Book and Special Collections Division, in part because we don't have the opportunity that a lot of college and university libraries have where Rare Books either runs the exhibition program or has their own space, we've taken to what I was describing earlier as tabletops. And that tends to be more of just a really luxurious spread of materials, but it's not content driven. It's typically more of format or genre, that is 100 books by 100 artist books by women or 160 alphabet books. So there's a gathering that allows people to come and go and have interests without the kind of heavy formality that Selby is talking about. It's a little bit more playful.
For my part, I'd just like to add a sort of psychological observation that's relevant to the question, which is what role that these can play in building bridges. I believe that events and exhibitions are really powerful tools for bridge building. I realize that there are issues with connecting with people and that some of them can be boring, but as an example of this, when I was in Las Vegas, again, this is in early years, we had a really great collection of material related to American presidents. And we had a book from Jefferson's library, and we had Lincoln spectacles and things like that. And we couldn't, for the life of us, get much attention locally. We were trying to work with the local papers and get put in the events pages that tourists use and all of that. And we couldn't drum up a lot of excitement. And so all we did was reposition the books into a couple specific showcases, put up signage, and turned it into an exhibit. And once it became an event, suddenly everyone was talking about it. Humans tend to think in terms of event. They're motivated by the idea of events, and it's kind of a silly thing, but it's actually quite powerful. So I think that acknowledging that certain things get reactions and using them effectively as such, that's what an exhibition can really do, is it can just wake people up that these things are here.
Our next question comes from Sandy, who asks, can you elaborate on the types of connections Rare Books make with people? What kinds of bridges can Rare Books create with people, especially young people of the digital generation?
I'm happy to give some examples of that, as I'm thinking particularly from the collections that I've seen with the Honey Wax Prize. One of the collections that we gave an honorable mention to in the first year was very instructive for us, because it was a woman who collected odori, these programs for these dance events that geisha put on annually in Kyoto. And the woman who collected them was big fan of geisha and was part of these online fan communities that were really interested in the history of geisha and geisha culture. And it was through connecting with that fan community that she got interested in these materials. And it was in part in order to sort of fill gaps in the knowledge of the fan community that she started collecting and looking for avenues to find this material. And so there was something that they were all sort of united by. And that theme that united them was the vehicle for them to connect and to build a community and to learn from each other and to enjoy each other's company. And I think that fundamentally that's a lot of what Rare Books offer, is that books are not just a representation of the novels that you read in school. Books represent every aspect of the history of civilization. If you're interested in architecture, if you're interested in design, if you're interested, in history, or I knew a guy who just collected any book related to elephants. Like, you can connect through books, and you can find communities through books. And to me, it always comes down to that fundamental human connection.
Any other comments? Yep, Krystal.
I was going to say, often in our classes or presentations, we will pair Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia with Phyllis Wheatley's poems on various subjects. So you have this, sort of, writer of the Declaration of Independence, this sort of, famous statesman of his era, sort of talking about various political issues, talking about race, talking about slavery, with this first published, woman of African descent. So juxtaposing them and seeing to what Jefferson has written about Phyllis Wheatley was that, she was no genius. And students are reading her works, her words, and sort of, they're seeing the dissonance between those two. And so they're seeing that knowledge is contested, and like people from different perspectives have different ideas. So it gives them a sense too that they have to look at different works from different perspectives and understand that there isn't sort of like a monolithic view of history or society that sort of complicates things to put things like that together.
It's great that Krystal used that example, because we do something quite similar. We share the same institutional burden of dealing with Jefferson and the myth. I often end with Jefferson's quote that God may have created Phyllis Wheatley, but Phyllis Wheatley did not create poetry. It's the same kind of moment in which people can come to a realization. I think bridges can be built in many different ways. I think we can, especially with younger viewers, we can put them, it is a connection to the past because we can find common threads. I think right now, for example, if I were to go back and have a group of high school and college age students, I would talk about how have you conveyed your political dissent, and how was that done in the 18th century, and can you understand the forms and the format and the language that it took, and who's excluded and who isn't. And I think there are ways of doing that where people can be brought to the past by finding a connection, a bridge, if you will. It works very well with, it can be as simplistic as referencing comic books or graphic novels when you talk about William Blake or block books. There's a way of just taking an experience that may be modern and connecting it to the same kind of device in an earlier period. But I think oftentimes books as objects can tell a story. Why did this woman from the south of the United States carry this book with her all the way to Canada? This book of crappy poetry. Why did she have it with her? And when you unfold the story and you learn that she was in the Underground Railroad and she was being led to freedom, and that she could have been killed for being able to read in the first place, they take on a meaning that puts them in a position. So I think we can tap into empathy and comparison in a way with a physical object of a book that all the yakking in the world would never get them to do.
Thank you so much. And with that, I think we've run out of time to answer the other questions in the chat, but we would just like to thank everyone for taking part in this event, and especially thank you to our panelists, Krystal, Mark, Rebecca, and Selby, for sharing your expertise and your experiences with us, and for helping us recreate the Rare Book School experience virtually. So please, thank you. Please accept our thanks, and thank you to everyone.